Well, thank you very much. It's really an honor to be here, especially since I'm seeing a couple of, nice colleagues whom I've met before. And it's always nice to share thoughts with you. And thank you to the organizer. It's a pleasure to be here, and I hope we will have some productive discussion after these presentations. My presentation today will be on short. In 20 minutes. I will present some of my work on platformization, governing platformization in Europe. And this will be my main question for today: how to govern platform societies based on public values, particularly in Europe. So that will be my lead question. I will sort of, really quickly guide you to three questions. What is platformization? I will talk a little bit about public values in contrast to economic values of corporate platform ecosystems. And then next, I will talk about some of the challenges we have in Europe that we're facing currently. My presentation will be based on two recent publications. One is a book called The Platform Society, which was published in 2018. And the other one is a more recent article, Seeing the Forest for the Trees, which is on platformization and was published in New Media and Society. So if you want to read more about these ideas, please feel free to check those out. Oops. Okay, sorry. So let me first start by raising the question of platformization and what it exactly is. But in order to explain that, I first need to talk a little bit about platform ecosystems. Platform ecosystems, of course, that is also a metaphor, but when I talk about them, I talk about basically two major ecosystems that have come to govern and control the internet today. One, on the left, of course, you see the American system, which is controlled by 5 big tech companies: Google, Alphabet, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, and Microsoft, and which actually is contrasted by the Chinese ecosystem, which is a system that is controlled by 3 major companies, Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent, but which is pretty much surveilled and controlled by the Chinese state. Now, either one of these ecosystems, on the left or on the right, they're either controlled by the market, the American system, or by the state, in the Chinese system. And pretty much one is reigning the other. But where in this scheme, where in these two systems is actually civil society? What role do, for instance, institutions and civic agents play in both of these systems? And that is a question I will raise throughout my presentation. Squeezed between the US and China and these two systems is Europe. Europe has no major tech firms. Despite a handful of unicorns, all major platform systems are actually run by American or Chinese firms. Now, it's pretty safe to assume that for all of their online infrastructural services, European countries have become largely dependent on the American platform ecosystem. There's a little bit of dependence on Chinese firms, but it's still very little. Europe's dependence on American big tech has become a political liability, as Europe is now caught between the superpowers' fight over technological control, and that is causing quite a number of geopolitical tensions. The GAFAM ecosystem, the American ecosystem, doesn't quite fit the European Rhineland model, the model which places emphasis on a balance between the state, the market, and civil society. Now, to explain how platform ecosystems operate and how they exert power, I use the metaphor of the tree. A much more common metaphor is actually the stack, but I find the tree a more instructive metaphor because not all platforms are equal. Some are more equal than others, and more importantly, they're not randomly stacked. So the tree as a metaphor, recognizes a hierarchical order with three types of platforms stacked on top of each other. First, I recognize the digital infrastructure in the roots of the tree, for instance, cables, satellites, protocols, data centers, computer hardware. Then I sort of distinguish the intermediary or gatekeeping platforms in the trunk, and those consist, for instance, of cloud services, data analytics, space systems, social media networks, search engines, app stores, identification platforms, etc., etc. And finally, the top layer, of course, are the branches of the trees, and they represent sectoral platforms. For instance, applications for education, for the education sector, or mobility, or finance. Now, there is no clear boundary between each of these levels when the roots end and when the trunk begins. They effectively, the boundaries between them are obliterated and transgressed by a process I call platformization. Now, here's a more, actually, this is an illustration that is from one of my articles, where it shows that platformization affirms that the center of platform power is located in the trunk of the tree. And those trunk services are actually bottlenecks for data collection. And what the tree in itself shows is the mechanism of power that is sort of hiding in its vertical integration. Single companies like Google or Apple or Facebook, they own and operate platforms at the same time in the roots, in the trunk, and in the sectoral layer. And they can integrate data flows across the tree. And in doing so, they cause what we call a vendor lock-in. One example is, for instance, Google, which owns data centers and hardware in operating systems in the root layer. They own analytics and storage space. They own search. They own the Play Store, of course. And in the branches, for instance, they're very strong in, let's take education, Google Scholar and Google Apps for Education. In fact, in the Netherlands, currently, I've just finished this research, 70 to 80% of all primary education is dependent on Google Apps and Google hardware and software. Now, platform services are increasingly offered as packages, one-stop shops to digital services and giving you access to all kinds of services in the three layers of the tree. And public sectors particularly have become almost completely dependent on the privatized gatekeepers of those infrastructures. They control most of the internet's shared data circuits, which have amassed and all these data points in the system. So in the American as well as in the Chinese ecosystem, data from citizens are controlled through platforms in the large and thick trunks. For Europe, though, both ecosystems pose serious problems. Problem one is that there's no democratic control in either ecosystem. The lack of transparency and accountability is increasingly problematic as it results, as you all know, in misinformation and surveillance. The second problem is that data in these two systems, they're either proprietary or they are controlled by the state. Citizens barely have any control over their data, and neither have public institutions control over data as a common good. And finally, that's a problem that I won't dwell on today, but ecosystems lack open spaces and that the sort of like in the kind of spaces that are usually reigned by civil society actors. If we look at this tree, of course, what we see is that we need an ecosystem, and this, of course, once again, the tree is a metaphorical concept that I use, but we need an ecosystem that is built on public values, one that invests in open platform infrastructures, given equal power to markets, to states, and to civil society stakeholders, which are relying on interoperability as the principle, on open standards. Now, Europe may help redesign a platform ecosystem, symbolized by a tree that doesn't have a tall or thick trunk, with a centralized concentration of power, but one with a short trunk and a diversity of branches which are rooted in public values and public spaces. Now, let me say a little bit more about public values and why we need public values, why they should be conditions for growing a different kind of tree. There are a number of public values that pertain to online users as individuals, as consumers or citizens, such as security and transparency. We don't want our data to be hacked or stolen. We expect to use an online service on transparent conditions. As consumers, we also expect accurate information, for instance, when we use health platforms or when we consume news. And of course, we expect privacy, respect for the boundaries of our personal information. But beyond those consumer or individually oriented public values, other values pertain to society as a whole. We expect from platforms that they act in accordance with values such as fairness, inclusiveness, non-discrimination, values like autonomy, accountability, or democratic control. And these public values often sit in tension with commercial values. For instance, privacy is often in tension with security, or public values, of course, that promote commercial values usually sit in tension with values like privacy. Public values, in fact, are not fixed. You can't just go to a store and buy them off the shelf. They're often negotiated and balanced off. For instance, the algorithms that enable personalized learning in a classroom may clash with student privacy, as well as with teachers' professional autonomy. So one of my theses of today's talk is that Europe needs to articulate a set of principles that prioritizes public values to help societal stakeholders create an open, democratic, and diverse platform ecosystem. Now, Europe may not be able to create its own ecosystem from scratch. I don't believe that is possible. You know, they can't just start operating social media platforms or create their own hardware devices and just ignore the ecosystems that are currently reigning the world. But they do need to articulate the rules and restrictions that uphold democracy's core principles in the digital society. And Europe needs to invest in an open infrastructure, giving equal space to market, state, and civil society stakeholders. So let me talk for a few more minutes on what this all means for Europe, the challenges for Europe. A continent, of course, as I just explained, that doesn't own or operate any crucial infrastructural or intermediary platforms. So what does this mean for existing legal frameworks? And can we articulate a set of principles to help redesign the American platform ecosystem? Currently, the EU is working on a comprehensive Digital Services and Digital Markets Act to assign transparent responsibility to platforms while protecting EU democracies. And this is not an easy feat. With this piece of legislation, which will probably be completed over the next 2 years, the European Commission wants to impose stricter rules on platform companies and give clarity about their liabilities. But in my opinion, legal frameworks alone are insufficient to counter the fundamental disruptive effects of platforms. And therefore, we should also work on changing the ecosystem's architecture and the way it operates by articulating principles of design. Now I have 3 short principles, suggestions for principles. The first one is to define fair web core principles for each actors. And in fact, just last year, no, actually it was in 2019, Tim Berners-Lee, the original inventor of the World Wide Web, wrote a manifesto called The Case for the Web. And he wanted to protect, in fact, his original design of the World Wide Web. He's very critical of how the web currently operates. And he wants to really make a case for open and democratic space on the internet. And this manifesto intended to provide a contract, a sort of social contract that contains core principles for, as you can see on this slide, for governments, for companies, and for citizens. In fact, all those three main actors are jointly responsible for the platform society. Now, last year, several major tech companies, including Facebook and Google, have signed this contract, and so have some states. But the problem is that many other companies and states have ignored the appeal. And for those who did sign, participation is actually non-committal. There are no sanctions for non-compliance.
Professor, 2 minutes more.
Yeah, I have 2 more slides. The second principle pertains to data and user sovereignty. First of all, Europe should define data ownership. For instance, data belong to citizens, or the open data belong to communities rather than to companies. Another rule may be data portability. You can carry your data around to different platforms without switching costs. You know, the way that you can switch your bank account or your phone number. And finally, data transparencies. Data flows can be regulated like money flows. For instance, we could install data accountants to regulate those transparency conditions. And finally, third, we could promote platform diversity. That's the third principle. We could stimulate public and non-profit platforms. Why don't we have public social media the way that we have public broadcasting as an alternative to Facebook? At the technical level, we can require interoperability between platforms. We can mandate open source software whenever possible. And of course, we can secure public online infrastructure. In fact, the European Commission is now looking into starting public cloud services. Indeed, I think to conclude, we need to rethink the architectural design and governance of platform ecosystems if we want to secure a fair and open digital society. And therefore, I think the EU should first make explicit the common principles for each responsible actors and then mandate them by law. Now, to end on an optimistic note, I really see encouraging signs of public counterpower. There's several national and local initiatives that I can talk more about if you wish, that are really start to coordinate platforms that are designed for the public good, for serving the public good. And there are a number of civil society efforts that I'm part of that try to protect public values on the internet. So what I would like to see most is a raised awareness at the national and EU levels to protect the integrity of public spaces on the internet. Thank you for
listening. Thank you, Professor. Thank you.